and welcome to the ESPN Aussie Hoops Hour. About a week away from the 2024 Paris Olympics. I'm Olgun Uluc. We usually focus on the Australian Boomers, the Australian national teams on this podcast, but I figured we'd change it up and go back to what's becoming a little bit of a tradition now, which is bringing my friend and colleague Brian Windhorst on the show to get his perspective on the Boomers, to talk through Team USA and talk through what is probably the most stacked Olympic basketball tournament we've ever had in the history of Olympic basketball tournaments. So, Brian, welcome from London. How is everything going?
Everything is great. Thanks for having me, Olgun. This is we've been doing the national teams together for years and years and years now. So it's I got to see the Aussies the other day in Abu Dhabi, and I know members of the coaching staff. I know a big chunk of the team. It's comfortable, but at the same time, it also means that, you have a lot of respect because and have history. You've seen these teams play against each other many times and know that there's, potentially chapters ahead. So it's exciting, and you understand sort of the moment.
So let's start with the Boomers, because you got to see them up close. They played Team USA. That was a 6-point loss. I think 6 points was quite flattering. I think that was more of a 10, 15, maybe 20-point win for the US. They sort of took their foot off the pedal for a little bit. But what did you think of what you saw from Australia in that game, and what you've seen of that group so far? I know you saw a practice as well.
Yeah. So first off, I thought that their execution in the second half was terrific. They had a really interesting game plan where they attacked the U.S. on the interior, not straight up, but through back cuts and through just interior passing, and they rebounded the ball extremely well, and they put up 68 points in the paint in a 40-minute game. I mean, 68 points in the paint in a 48-minute NBA game would be something that the coach would come ranting and raving into the locker room about. 68 points in a 40-minute FIBA style game is an incredible performance. It actually was an alarm bell for the U.S. And it led to them playing a much better interior game against Serbia, who in theory is stronger on the interior than Australia. So I thought that they had good execution. Also, and this is something that Coach Gorgine mentioned after the game, you may look at that and say, well, it was garbage time or whatever, but considering the group of death that Australia is facing in Paris, where score differential and margin is going to be important, that was actually an excellent step forward and good practice for them. And, that type of performance actually can make the difference between advancing or not. I also thought that, first off, Jock Landale looked great. And the US's big men are Joel Embiid, who's a former MVP, Bam Adebayo, and Anthony Davis, who were both first-team all-defensive players in the NBA this year. And for Jock to have that type of performance on that is extremely promising. And so I actually think that Australia came out of Abu Dhabi. In my view, I wasn't really sure where the Aussies collectively ranked in this tournament. And I now come out of watching them in Abu Dhabi thinking they're very strong medal contenders. And their performances were very impressive. Obviously against Serbia too, which we can talk about later. Overall, watching them, Josh Giddey is he's arguably their most important player at this point. With the way they play, and you can tell that they really want to he's going to be very important to what they do, and he's going to put up enormous numbers. In fact, I actually kind of felt like that game, because, everything, a lot of things that we do are still through the NBA lens. I feel like that game is going to resemble many, many, many forthcoming Chicago Bulls games this year, where Josh Giddey puts up big numbers, makes a lot of big plays, and the Bulls lose. I'm advising all of my friends who are in fantasy leagues to get Josh Giddey, because he's gonna have a triple double. He's going to put up a ton of triple doubles this year, I think. And he was sniffing around a triple double in that game, and so his size and his playmaking ability, he's going to be one of the stories of the Olympics. As upsetting as the performance in the World Cup was last year for the Aussies, I thought Josh had a breakout performance in that World Cup. I thought he looked terrific in the games. I didn't see all of their games, but I think I saw 2 of them. And, he's carried that over. So I think, they're probably within the team, they're probably cautiously optimistic with where they are, considering the what's ahead of them in this pool play. And I have to emphasize, this is the best Team USA definitely since 2008, definitely. And in all honesty, 1 through 12, probably since the Dream Team 90s teams. They currently start a starting lineup that has a collective 7 MVPs, and Kevin Durant isn't playing. So it'll be 8 when he comes back and starts. Like I said, they bring 2 first-team All-NBA defensive big men off the bench. They're awesome. They really shouldn't be touched in this tournament, but the FIBA game is so different to them, and the free FIBA game is so fragile. So you would never assume anything.
It's funny. I think Australians feel the same way that you feel about the Boomers, where they came in with not too optimistic about the potential fortunes of this team. I remember last year we spoke about the sort of transitional nature of what that Boomers team was. It was going from some of those older guys into Josh Giddey and Josh Green, and it was Matisse Thybulle. He's not on this team, but Dyson Daniels and some of these younger guys. And I think what this coaching staff tried to do was they think they figured out how to mesh the 2 things, which is basically find a through line of the identity, which I think they're trying to lean on toughness and sort of defensive capacity. And they think that's the way to mesh these 2 teams together. So I think most people agree with you, and I definitely do, as far as coming out of these Team USA and Serbia games, way more optimistic about how this team looks. I think there is a clear identity. I think there are clear defined roles. And I don't think there's just a reliance on this guy's in the NBA. We saw that with Matisse Thybulle, who got cut from this team. We saw that from Duop Reith, who is ostensibly the 12th man on this team. Will Magnay, who had a cup of coffee with the Pelicans on a 2-way deal a few years ago. He is the backup center for this team instead of Duop Reith, who's coming off a really good season.
I really honestly couldn't have told you anything about Will Magnay 10 days ago. If you had told me he was a 2-way player in the NBA, I would not have remembered that. He actually was more of a factor. Sorry, not to interrupt you, but
No, of course.
Yeah.
No, he came on and had an impact. But then, as optimistic as we are now of Australia, and I sort of maybe put them on the edge of those group of contending teams. You do bring up Team USA being really, 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 really talented and stacked, and I still don't see anyone really competing with them. And at this point, watching the warm-up game so far, I don't know what the weakness is when I look at that Team USA team. I don't know if you see one.
Interior defense still, even though they're equipped to handle. I think their biggest weakness is that they're NBA players. Sure. And what I mean by that is in the NBA, 48-minute game, huge number of possessions in the way the modern game is played. One thing that we now see very routinely in NBA games is massive runs. We see one team up by 17 points in the third quarter and lose. That happens almost on a nightly basis in the NBA. And I always tell people leading up to the Olympics and within the Olympics, the World Cup, the difference between the 40 and the 48-minute game, I cannot overstate. I would pound the table if it wouldn't be annoying, that difference. And USA has lost games because they have 5-minute stretches where they just sort of lose their focus. And in the NBA game, especially in an average NBA game, that's not penal. In the FIBA game, it can kill you. And that's what happened in this game against the Aussies. It was a 17-point game. The U.S. knew they had it won, and they let their guard down. And next thing you know, it's a 4-point game. And they bailed themselves out because they hit a couple of threes, but they very easily could have missed those shots. And Australia could have taken the lead. And if that happens at the wrong time in the knockout stage, you're going home. And it has happened to the U.S. before in the knockout stage. So The only thing I'll say I take away is that last year in Abu Dhabi, that's where the U.S. came before they went to Manila. They played Germany, and Germany wasn't quite the same type of game. Germany was leading for most of the game, and then in the fourth quarter, the U.S. went on a big run. Anthony Edwards had a huge run, and really kind of the story of the night became Anthony Edwards emerging as one of Team USA's best players. But really what happened that night was Germany learned that they got a bunch of confidence against the Americans. And then when they played, when it mattered in the or in the semifinals about 3 weeks later, 2-3 weeks later, their mentality was completely different. It's not the same as coming from behind and closely losing, but if the Australians play the Americans later, in the medal round, they will have known that they put together a quarter plus of really competitive basketball against them, and it could matter later on.
And that's the reason why I like the tack of this USA basketball warm-up schedule. Because it was against Canada, who was sort of like a Team USA light in the way they're sort of built, and then it was against Australia, who is this tough team. So all of a sudden, I think Australia is maybe the only team in this Olympic basketball field who is sort of defined by their toughness and that sort of grit. And then it was Serbia, and now they're going on and they play South Sudan, and then they play Germany again, right? So I think they're hitting every single type of team that you could potentially face in FIBA ball, right? Serbia was a Euro-centric team, a team that has a lot of FIBA guys and has an elite big. Germany has a lot of FIBA guys and an elite FIBA point guard in Dennis Schroeder. So I think it's something that I don't want to. Maybe it's a nice level of humility that I think is coming from USA Basketball, where they don't just think that they're going to put together this uber talented team and it's just going to roll over every other team. They're putting themselves through a very legitimate warm-up process, which I kind of appreciate.
Yeah, I mean, they have to, because these teams all have so much on them in terms of continuity. And, one of my things is the U.S., with the changing of the schedule, where the World Cup and the Olympics are played in back-to-back summers, the U.S. has blown up its policy that it used to have, that you have to commit for 3 summers. The U.S., after they lost the 2004 games in Athens, they had the bronze there. They instituted a new policy that if you wanted to play in the Olympics, you had to play 3 summers. 1 summer of the World Cup, then there would be like a week-long training camp where they just sort of touched base and everything, and maybe even played 1 exhibition game. And then the following year, there would be the Olympics. And so, of course, the roster changed a little bit, but generally, when they got together for the Olympics, they had been together for the core of the team had been together for 3 summers. They had to abandon that. And so I saw the advantages that teams in Manila last year had after playing in the European Championships the summer before. Like Germany won because of the chemistry that they had built that started in the Euros. Serbia won because of that, they got to the gold medal game, and it was not a mistake. That it was not I think, out of the final 8 teams, I think 5 of them were from Europe. Obviously Europe has great depth, but it's not a mistake. They all had this advantage. And so the U.S.
saw Latvia get deep in that tournament. A lot of these teams that outside of Europe, really know about
Lithuania,
they know these FIBA nuances.
Yeah, Lithuania, Montenegro, Slovenia, which, they ended up disappointing, but Slovenia, with Luka and all that stuff. So they have to do that. And I also think that it's the huge thing interesting about Australia is that most FIBA teams, are either built around the centers, the bigs, or built around the guards. And that's, one of the things that was controversial with the U.S. over the last 10 days is when Kawhi Leonard had to withdraw or was thrown out, cut, whatever, nobody wants to say the word cut, but essentially he was cut. They went with Derek White over Jaylen Brown. Created a lot of conversation in the States. And the thing is, the U.S. frankly needs more. They need big man defenders and they need guard defenders, because that's what they have to defend. There's 2 teams in this tournament that have, NBA level wings other than the US. One is Canada, and the other is Australia. Australia can play a game that is, generally more, I don't want to say more threatening, but, um, you know, it's they're more dynamic throughout their roster because they have NBA level wing players that they put out there. And
They're
because of
versatile
that,
defensively. They push the pace, right?
exactly. And they have, you know, big, terrific guards. The thing about the European teams, they have amazing big men, but the European guard play is relatively poor. What holds these teams back is, in a lot of cases, their lack of guard play. For example, France is going to run Rudy Gobert and Victor Wembanyama out there, but you look at their guards and it's just they cannot compete. Now, in the next Olympics in LA, they might have some guards who are in the NBA. I mean, their program is definitely developing. I think France is maybe a lot of people think France could contend for a medal. They're playing at home. I'm not so sure they are, and I think one of the things we've kind of seen that a little bit in their warmups. Serbia to me is as legit of a team to beat the U.S. as anybody because they have Jokic, and they also have a couple of NBA level guards in Bogdan Bogdanovic and Vasily Micic. Those are guys who play in the NBA, and the Australians beat them, with a very impressive win. Serbia had gone to France. In France, they beat the French in Lyon just before coming to Abu Dhabi. And Australia is playing the second night of a back-to-back, and they overwhelmed Serbia down the stretch of that game. It was obviously a terrific game for Patty Mills, and that's the thing. You have a player like Patty Mills. Patty Mills has the capacity, even now, to be the best player on the floor in a FIBA style game. So the Aussies have a number of different ways that they can win, and they're going to need them because they are facing. I think I can't speak with confidence about what the group play was like in 1960 in Rome, but maybe this is arrogance of the modern times, but I do not believe there's ever been a group in the history of the basketball and the Olympics, a group play that has ever been as competitive as what the Australians are walking into. So having that versatility of ways that they can win and having that size is going to be really important starting in about 10 days in France.
Yeah, and I think that group is why most people weren't too optimistic about how this Australian team was going to go because they didn't. I had to leave. I went from Okinawa back to Australia. I never even got to see.
I know. I was looking forward to seeing you. I haven't seen you since China. No, we saw each other in the U.S. a couple of years ago, but still.
Yeah, so I was hoping to get to Manila, and this team didn't even get out of Okinawa. We had to go straight home, and so people were naturally a little bit pessimistic about how this team could go. But these games have maybe lifted the spirits of Australians and probably the team as well. I don't know.
Rightfully so. Absolutely.
I don't know if this team really thought that they were going to go and actually compete for a medal, let alone a gold medal. There are some players on this Australian team who I think people are really going to like. I think you're the more you watch this Australian team, I think you're really going to enjoy them too. Let's put aside Matthew Dellavedova, who obviously you've covered before, and he missed out on that World Cup team and then worked on his body in a really intense way and made this team, right? And he's someone who they think he's not going to get a ton of minutes, but he can be sort of the point of difference in guiding the identity.
He came into the game in the fourth quarter and made instantaneously an 8-point difference with 3 plays in the game.
There are situations where he will play 4 to 6 minutes and he'll be on the floor with Dyson Daniels and they're just going to be amazingly chaotic defensively. And then they'll push the ball and they think that in Olympic basketball, where the margin for error is so slim, that those 5 minutes could spell the end of your tournament or they could get you through to the next round of a tournament.
That's
right?
correct. Yeah.
So they thought that in this instance, having Delhi there to give you those 4 minutes of positive basketball, as opposed to someone like Matisse Thybulle, who they're not sure what he'll give you in a 4-minute spurt, right? That was a big consideration when this team was being chosen.
Well, I'm not saying it's exactly apples to apples, but choosing Matthew Dellavedova over Matisse Thybulle is probably got some of the same reasons why the Americans chose Derek White over Jaylen Brown, because having a dynamic guard under a lot of circumstances and a lot of matchups can make more sense than having an extra wing, especially if that wing isn't dynamic. And I love Matisse, but I don't think anybody would call him dynamic.
Yes. And another player who I think you're going to love is Jack McVeigh. So Jack McVeigh, 4 years ago, he was a role player on the Adelaide 36ers team that Josh Giddey was on as an 18-year-old. Um, he was the eighth or ninth guy on that NBL team, and 4 years later, he's on this Olympic team with Josh Giddey. So over the past 12 months, he plays for the Tasmania Jack Jumpers here in the NBL. He was the championship series MVP, so the
Yeah,
finals
I was like,
MVP.
what's the championship, the team, the winners, right? The Jack Jumpers.
Exactly, and he was their best player. He's an Australian kid. He went to Nebraska for 4 years to play college basketball. He had sort of an up and down career in Nebraska, but instead of so he got married in the off season, and instead of going on his honeymoon, he went to the Australian Boomers camp, sort of as a fringe guy to get selected. Shot the lights out in camp. He was extremely impressive at camp, made shots, and he filled that sort of designated shooter role. And he made this team. He's a really positive guy. He's someone who I think does a good job of connecting this team, because I think he's an offensive point of difference. He's someone who, again, you're going to get eyes on Australia. You're going to watch this guy. He's a bundle of energy. I think you're really, really going to enjoy him. And he just agreed to a two-way deal with the Houston Rockets. So this has been a wild sort of last 2 or 3 months for Jack McVeigh. I think you're really going to like him.
Yeah, I certainly know who he is because I live in Nebraska.
Yes.
But I wasn't familiar with his game. So, the guard play that the Aussies have is outstanding, and again will help them against some of these European teams who have spectacular interior play but not as strong guard play. And their wings will help them potentially against the U.S. Their guards will help them against the European teams, and I really think that other than Canada, the variety of players, the only team that can compare to the variety of players, the talent and the size and the positionality, is Australia. And if those end up being the three medalists, it wouldn't shock me. I still think Serbia is extremely dangerous because of Jokic, but if in a month those are the three medalists for that reason, and because you've got a player like Jack McVeigh, and you've got players like Josh Green and Dyson Daniels, there's just nobody in the tournament who can compare with the size on the guard line. Just even the U.S., I guess, depending on what position LeBron plays, but Dyson Daniels and Josh Giddey as your guards, they're like 6'9".
It's really just Canada. It's really just Canada,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Canada
I mean,
has those 3-and-D wings. They've got RJ Barrett and Lou Dort, and Lou Dort's not big, obviously, but they have these like NBA type wings, so they can sort of compete
right,
physically.
right. I mean, Dyson Daniels and Josh Green and Josh Giddey, find me the perimeter with that size. You just don't see it. And the U.S. had trouble dealing with that at times, for sure.
Yeah. Who else are you seeing as potential contenders out there? We mentioned Serbia, right? And it's Jokic and Bogdanovic, and again, very FIBA nuance sort of guys. I think Spain bowed out early at the World Cup, and they're a team that wants to come back. They got the Hernan Gomez brothers. They have Rudy Fernandez going to a sixth Olympics, Santi Aldama. So they've got an interesting mix of NBA and FIBA guys too, and obviously France, who again you mentioned them as a 2028 sort of contender. By then they'll have Nolan Traore and some of these other guys coming through, but obviously Rudy and Wemby is a thing. Who do you think are those teams that can actually maybe compete with Team USA?
Yeah. Okay. So the Australian fans are going to have to pay close attention to a handful of games in pool play, because there are 12 teams in the tournament, 8 are going to advance, and so the the struggle to and I believe that those 8 will be basically form the most competitive single elimination tournament. I guess it's not single elimination for the bronze, but single elimination. That 8, that those quarterfinals, that group of 8 will create the most competitive tournament in the history of international tournament, in the history of the sport. And so getting to that 8 is going to be an incredible scrap for Australia because of their group. Obviously, there's 3 groups, 8 teams advance. So you can figure this out. 2 groups will have 2 teams advance, and 1 group will have 3 teams advance. Australia needs to really hope that Group A has 3 teams advance. And so what you need, there's a couple of games you really need to pay attention to elsewhere. And also you have to hope that there's not an upset somewhere. Like, for example, in Group B, that's France, Germany, Japan, and Brazil. Like, when Brazil plays Germany or Brazil plays France, you really kind of root against Brazil there. You can't have Brazil pulling an upset against France or Germany, and then all of a sudden you get 3 teams in that group that are 2-1, where France and Germany knock each other off or whatever. You need that to be one team 3-0, one team 2-1, one team 1-2, one team 0-3. So there's only 2 teams that come out of there. In Group
and also
C,
you're hoping. I agree, but also you're hoping for, let's say, in that group, you're hoping for those top teams to blow out every other team because you want the points differential to be in your favor too.
That's exactly right. You can't have like Puerto Rico upsetting Serbia, or something like that. You need, again, in Group C, you need a 3-0 team, a 2-1 team, a 1-2 team, and a 0-3 team. You can't have 2 2-1 teams in there. So with that said, I think the team that nobody's talking about, and I'm going to get a look at them here on Monday in London, is Germany. Germany they played brilliant basketball as a group in winning that World Cup last year. I don't think anybody thought that even after I saw them play impressively in the run-up games in Abu Dhabi last year, it wasn't like I looked at them and said, oh yeah, that's going to be a world champ. I looked at them and saying that's a very good team. But they threatened at the European Championships 2 years ago. They obviously won the World Cup last year. They have that dynamic perimeter playmaker in, I tell people in the U.S. that Patty Mills morphs into Steve Nash in FIBA play.
What is Dennis Schroeder?
But that's what I'm saying. Yeah. So like that, like Patty Mills in China in 2019 was one of the best players in the world. And, obviously if you followed Patty for his whole career and you saw him when he was really young and like one of the fastest players with the ball on the planet, you saw that there was that capability. But, that's what Dennis Schroeder turns into. Schroeder is extremely fast with the ball. And he's a guy who's very confident in himself. And in the NBA, that confidence sometimes gets stifled by a little bit of reality. That confidence comes out with Germany, and Germany is humongous across the front line. They have just, they start this center who's this big bruising guy, Voigtman, Daniel Tice, who plays center in the NBA effectively, plays 4 for them. And then Franz Wagner, who's 6'10", plays 3. Tice is less than 6'10". He's maybe 6'8" or whatever, but he plays bigger than his size. So they're, Voigtman 7 foot. Then they come off the bench with Mo Wagner, who's an NBA level player. They have good wing shooting. They are a powerful team. And that group of the 3 groups, somebody's going to be least paid attention to, and that group is the least paid attention to group, because you have the group of death. Death isn't what's a fate worse than death, Olgun? Because that's what Group A is. Group of death doesn't even really explain.
Group of hell, probably.
Yes, absolutely, because it's where you go after death.
Unending torture is, I think, what that is. Yeah.
It's perfect. Well done. And then Team USA, you have Serbia and the US, 2 teams that I honestly think could. Obviously the U.S. is a heavy favorite, but Serbia can come into this honestly believing they could win the gold medal. And then you have this Group B with France and Germany. So France, I think, is they're a medal contender. They're going to be playing at home. Victor Wembanyama is going to be, um, the shining object that you're going to want to watch in this tournament. I'm an extremely big believer in that. I have a rule where I put no ceilings on Victor Wembanyama. If you said to me, could Victor Wembanyama lead France to the gold medal in this? I would not rule it out. I don't think that would happen, but I would not rule it out. I would not say no way, because I think that highly of him. But France and Germany are both very strong teams. I mean, I look at this. Australia can medal. Canada can medal. Spain, I don't love it, but I would be disrespectful to say they couldn't medal. Serbia can medal. The U.S. can medal. France can medal. Germany can medal. That's 8 teams. And that doesn't include me speaking of the Greeks, who have arguably the best player in the world. Between Giannis and Jokic, you can get when you have the best player in the world, anything can happen. We saw in Japan in the last Olympics, the best individual player in that tournament was Luka Doncic, and he took the Slovenians within a whisker of winning a medal, as the Australian fans remember. And I can't say that Giannis couldn't pull off some sort of run like that. So we're talking about sort of 8.5 teams that I think are legitimate medal contenders. And so that's what we're faced with in this tournament. And so it's going to be, that's the kind of level of play that we're headed for in France.
So that's 9 teams, and 4 of them are in Australia's group. It looks unbelievably daunting. And Greece is a great shout because it's obviously Giannis, right, who is the focal point of what they do. But they're really well coached. They got Spanoulis as their head coach, and then they have a really high level FIBA point guard in Nick Kalathis. He averaged, I want to say,
a genuine graybeard.
Yeah, like over 10 assists a game in that Olympic qualifying tournament. And that's another thing. A lot of these teams have gone through these Olympic qualifying tournaments playing real meaningful basketball. Yeah. Whereas everyone else is sort of playing warm-up games, and yes, they're treating them with a level of seriousness, but going through actual do-or-die games, I think that's gonna be a helpful thing for Greece and for Spain, and obviously they're the 2 in Australia's group. The Greek situation scares me from an Australian perspective. With Spain, I have a feeling that there may be a level below some of those other teams we mentioned. But I agree
still,
with you
Spain beat the Bahamas to, they were at home, but they beat, and there was, I didn't see the game, but there was some cries of officiating shenanigans, which
I watched the game. It was fine.
Okay.
It was fine.
Okay.
But the Bahamas was a real team. That was DeAndre
Hayden,
it
was a great win.
Hield and Eric Gordon. But I agree with you that it's weird that no one mentions Germany, because they're the reigning world champions. And when we talk about all these Euro teams who are either or some of these teams that are really stacked at the guard spot, or teams that are really stacked at the big spot, and we sort of just like brush over Germany, who I think has good depth in both areas, right? We saw Germany up close in Okinawa. They played Australia. They didn't have Franz Wagner in that game. They beat Australia. Again, I don't know if I saw them as you guys can win at all, but I definitely saw them as you guys are this is a very legitimate contender in front of me. So I'm surprised that not enough people talk about them. I get Wembanyama is sexy as an idea, right? And I think so is Canada, and so is Serbia because it's Jokic, and Greece because of Giannis. But yeah, the idea of facing Germany, I don't know if any team wants to do that. That makes me think that Group B, I have a feeling that France and Germany is just going to run the table on basically everyone else in that group. And as much as Brazil has an interesting group that they have together, they've got Raul Neto and Marcelo Huertas, but I don't see them competing with
I don't have Brazil as a medal contender. Another player from Germany, by the way, and I made the same mistake as the other Americans did. Andreas Obst,
shooter,
who had 24 points against the Americans in the a wing shooter, had 20. And after the game, Steve Kerr basically admitted we didn't pay enough attention to Andreas Obst. I think at the time,
FIBA ball.
I know. I think at the time he was a free agent. He didn't even have a team. I don't, I think he later signed with Bayern Munich, I think. But this is the thing, we're talking about these teams and we're guilty of not mentioning Germany. So also Germany is just very savvily prepared. They have an excellent coach, veteran coach. And they have all the pieces that you need. So I really have no idea who, honestly, getting to the semifinals is an incredible accomplishment. If you can make it from the cut from 12 to 8, it's awesome. And if you can make it from the cut from 8 to 4, like, you have accomplished something that your organization should be really proud of. That's just what we're headed for.
So two things. One, I think Obst is another example of it's not just about picking the most talented guy, right? And it's something that for example, when the Australian team was picked, I know the next day Brian Gorgon, I had a chat with him and he said he sat everyone down and said, this isn't a group of the most talented players I have. Australia left Xavier Cooks at home. Xavier Cooks is about to play for Brian Gorgon at the Sydney Kings for the next 3 seasons. Gorgon cut him, even though he is one of the most talented 12 basketball players that he could have picked, but it wasn't necessarily the most balanced team if you included him because he's not a great shooter. They included guys like Nick Kay and Jack McVeigh. So I think Obst is another example where not enough, I think you think that, let's talk about Isaac Bonga because he's former NBA, he's an NBA guy, and people don't talk about the Euro guy who is the sort of the glue that holds all this other talent together. So I think that's a really good example of that. Another team that I think you're going to get some eyes on in London, and they're in the USA's group as well. And I know they're a team that you were enamored with in Manila because I think they were playing at Araneta and you were at the Mall of Asia, but that was still around, is that South Sudanese team. Now, we're quite familiar with the South Sudan.
I mean, they're really an Australian team. If the Aussies have something else to do, also root for the South Sudanese team. First off, they're a great story. Secondly, they're made up of mostly Australians.
It's largely South Sudanese Australians. It is half the team are practically NBL players. Yeah. But they're another team that's really interesting because there's always the one African nation. And I think last Olympics, everyone was really enamored by Nigeria because they beat the USA. And again, they were really talented. They were a really unique group. This South Sudanese team is led by Mariel Shayok. They've got Wenyan Gabriel. They've got Bul Kuol, who is a star at the NBL level out here. They've got really interesting pieces. They've got that length. They've got that athleticism. I don't know if they're going to... Again, it's USA and Serbia in that group as well, right? So it's tough. Even Puerto Rico, they're coming off a win over Lithuania in the Olympic qualifying tournament. They're tough. But you can't really get past the South Sudan story. And then what I think is super intriguing talent on that team too.
Yeah, so, the big name, and I don't think he'll play a big role, but Kaman Maluak, who is going to very likely be a lottery pick in the NBA next year. And one of the success stories of the NBA's development system that they've got in place in Africa. He's 19. I don't know if he's at his 19th birthday yet, but 18, 19 years old. I believe he's about 7'3". Built a lot like Chet Holmgren, Victor Wembanyama, sort of this new age of these super athletic, super tall, lean guys. He didn't have that big of a role on the team last year, but the fact that he's on the team, he's going to Duke. American fans will certainly see and learn a lot about him. He's going to be playing with Cooper Flagg at Duke. Cooper Flagg, potential number 1 overall pick in the draft next year. So
I think Maluach played 20 minutes in a warm-up game yesterday, so I think he's about to be a legitimate part of this group.
Yeah, okay. So they have this guard who's really an American, Carlick Jones, who was one of the best players in Manila last year. He's a G League player, minor leagues. I'm surprised he didn't get more of a chance in the NBA after as good as he looked in Manila. He looks spectacular. He's sort of the South Sudanese version of Dennis Schroeder. He's given free reign. Last year, you actually had clued me into just how many NBL players were on their team because they had warm-up games in Australia. So I came a little bit more aware of them because actually this podcast that we had a year ago. And so I paid very close attention to them and I knew about Mal Uluc, Jonathan Gavoni, who's our draft expert at ESPN, was certainly very aware of him as, really the shining example of the NBA's academy in Australia, finding and developing a player and, being able to send one to a top college or, be a top draft pick. They're hoping that there's going to be a pipeline of that in the future. And, the future of basketball is really from African talent. African talent is the next frontier of, African talent's already making a huge impact in the NBA. We have, Giannis Antetokounmpo is of African descent, not of Greek descent. Joel Embiid is, born and raised in Cameroon. Pascal Siakam. These are top players in the league. I mean, the future of the NBA is through African talent, and the South Sudanese represent that. Getting to their game against Angola last year to determine, it was, basically to determine like 11th place in the World Cup, but it was for the African bid. And it was a horrible day in Manila that day. It's monsoon season when we were there. Vicious driving rainstorm the entire morning to get to this game, which I think was like at 1 or 2 o'clock in sort of the smaller venue in Manila. And there was, maybe 500-600 people at the game. But what it meant to the South Sudanese to win this. And, I'm not sure if any of the players had actually ever been to the South Sudan. They have subsequently gone to the South Sudan. And unfortunately, over the last year, the climate in Sudan, the South Sudan, has not been good. It's not been a positive story at home. So I think that they were intending to spend some more time in the South Sudan ahead of the Olympics. I'm not sure they actually got to do that. I know that they were.
No, so there are no basketball courts in South Sudan.
There's basketball courts, but there's no covered basketball courts. Yeah.
So they held their training camp in Rwanda, is what I was
right
told.
In Kigali.
So,
yeah.
So again, and sorry to interrupt, but the Olympic bid obviously meant a lot for them, and again, there weren't that many people in the crowd, but being at these tournaments, you see how much even just a win can mean for some of these smaller nations or these newer nations, right? I was there outside the hotel when Cape Verde won their first ever game as a national team, and had people with jukeboxes on their shoulders. It was such an unbelievable scene. So South Sudan, just to do that was really.
They're actually staying in this hotel. They're actually in this hotel where I'm at here in London. And so like the idea that they're, that the South Sudan is playing Team USA at the O2 Arena. It's on a Saturday night in London in July. Like even that is a pretty wild set of circumstances from where everybody was a year ago. So they're a great story, but in this tournament, I don't think that they're much of a competitor. But players of Sudanese descent have been playing in the NBA for decades. So, and these players are all basically the children of refugees, children or grandchildren of refugees. So it is a fascinating story. It isn't the story of like out of a movie where these players were found out in the hinterlands and came together. I mean, these players were, like I said, most of them from Australia, a couple of them from America, but still they came together. And when the program started, really a few years ago, they were practicing outdoors, I believe, in Egypt. They didn't even have when they first came together for their first African qualifying. They didn't even have an indoor facility to play in. And their coach, Royal Ivy, who's an assistant coach with the Houston Rockets, he talked about looking up at practice and seeing like vultures circling around their practice court and going, we got a long way to go. So to go from there to be, floating down the Seine in a couple of days, representing the nation at the opening ceremony of the Olympics, it's a pretty remarkable story.
Yeah, I cover a lot of those guys in the NBL, and I think there was a migration from South Sudan to Australia around the mid '90s, and a lot of these guys they either came from South Sudan or they were in refugee camps in Ethiopia or Kenya or Egypt, and they were in the midst of a civil war out there, and they almost fled to Australia.
Unfortunately,
And
the Civil War is kind of still going.
totally, the climate
Yeah.
is not great out there, but yeah, for them to be able to, it's it's really cool watching these guys who have sometimes represented Australia, and then they shift because there's now an opportunity to represent their country of birth or their country of heritage, to represent them. You can tell that it means something a little bit more for them. One thing on that, and I think there's a bit of reporting on that, is Thon Maker was supposed to be a part of that South Sudan team. He was part of the extended squad for the Australian team going into last year's World Cup. Did not make the team, but he switched to South Sudan. But I'm told that his FIBA clearance did not come through, so he will not be part of that team. They have a team of 13 right now in London. They're going to play their game against the USA, and I think they have one more game out there. They had that game against Great Britain last night, and then they'll whittle that down to 12 before they go to the Olympics. I'm curious to circle back to Team USA. When I look at the FIBA game, it feels like they're a team that should be they should benefit from the FIBA rules. I think of things like no 3 seconds, so the paint is packed, and on this team, it's you do have high level shooters out there. So you do have Steph Curry, who is playing on what, a 22-foot 3-point line, right? That
Yeah,
is
but the
an
top of the
obscene
key,
advantage for him.
it's 3 feet closer to the top of the key. This is a guy who
Right,
shoots
that
3
is
feet
so
behind
unfair.
it. Yeah.
Exactly. And then I think of the goaltending rules, where you do have Joel Embiid and Anthony Davis and Bam Adebayo and all the athletes across the board. That should help them. I'm thinking of the no 3 seconds. You can have those dudes just planted in the paint for the entirety of a possession if you want. And we saw that the amount of times Josh Giddey he got to his spot in the paint and is just a big dude in there because that guy doesn't have to leave the paint. It seems like they should benefit them. But then there are the rules on the flip side that I think they're still sort of struggling with. Some of the fouls I think are interesting, of some of the foul baiting that they're not getting because the FIBA refs don't really fall for that.
Huge.
What do you think of that? Do you think that any of those FIBA nuances, not that they're going to bite Team USA and going to cause them to lose, but may cause a little bit of consternation in that camp?
Joel Embiid is completely lost, because you have to understand that Embiid, he has played exactly 3 games with a national team in his life.
Yeah.
So like the other day they're playing against Serbia. How many games in Jokic's life, if you include the juniors, has he played on his national team? Over 100, I'm almost guaranteeing you. And Embiid was playing his 3rd. And so you've got Embiid, throwing his body into defenders and falling down like he does 17 times a game in the NBA, and the referee just looking at him.
Call in the NBA.
Yes, and the referee just looking at him, and he totally doesn't understand the rules about goaltending. The other day against Australia, he's calling for a goaltend. I can't remember if it was Landale or Nick Kay or somebody who pulled the ball off the rim, and he's looking over at the referee and putting up his hand like goaltend. Like, no. And then the other day against Serbia, the ball is bouncing on the rim, and he's standing underneath the rim, standing on the court, waiting for it to come out of the cylinder to try to get the rebound. Joel, once it hits the rim, you can get it. It's one thing to explain it. It's another thing to do it. He's had 10,000 hours of rebounding, watching the ball having to come out of the cylinder. So he is definitely behind on those rules. Anthony Davis, meanwhile, is thriving with them because Anthony Davis does have a history of playing for the national team. He did not do it the last couple of rounds, but he had 8 blocks in the 2 games in Abu Dhabi. He is very comfortable sitting in that lane, and they've got him playing center, and they've got Bam Adebayo playing power forward, and Adebayo is very much enjoying the shorter 3-point line. Adebayo is known as an excellent mid-range shooter. Not that the 3-point line is mid-range, but he made 15 3-pointers in all of his play with the Miami Heat this last year, and he made 3 in the first half against Serbia the other night, and he loves it. He is a guy who has to play bigger men at center for 6 months in the NBA. He's, I don't know what his official height is, but he's probably roughly about 6'9", and he's guarding over 7-footers every night, all bigger than him, and succeeding. He, just got himself a $160 million contract extension. And he's all defensive player. He's not struggling, but the idea of him playing 4-man and getting to shoot, he loves it. But the officiating is a big thing. And the other thing is keeping composure, because again, something happens in the NBA. Technical fouls are routine, especially, in the first 3 quarters. In the NBA, you get called for technical. In a lot of ways, getting called for technical can sometimes be helpful. It costs you some money, but these guys have money. They don't care about that. It's usually totally forgotten. Well, if you get called for a technical after you're upset about it getting called for a foul, that's 40% of your fouls allowed, because technicals are personal fouls. The other thing is, the players can't call timeout. Yeah. This is something that it's not a big rule until somebody screws it up when at the vital spot. They have changed the rules now in the NBA. One of the things that would constantly happen is, I'm not even sure what the FIBA rule is actually called, but in the NBA, they do have rules now about take fouls or transition fouls. In FIBA, if you grab a guy in transition, it's a technical foul. That's essentially the case now in the NBA, but for years that wasn't the case. And you would see these players grab a guy in transition and it's a technical, and they're like, wait a minute, I thought I was actually making a smart play. So that maybe not be a thing, but yeah, it's a real thing. And more than anything, I think dealing with the officiating, FIBA officiating is, it's scattered. And in a 40-minute game or in a 5 foul out situation, it's just so different from the NBA. And so those are all big factors. And the thing that the US, and I think generally they do a good job of this, but their nature kind of hurts them. For as much of an advantage as the US's talent is and depth, they're at a disadvantage every single game, almost every single game, with their lack of knowledge and comfort with the rules and their lack of chemistry together. They have to respect that. And this team's done okay so far, but again, all it takes is a lack of respect for that at the wrong time in the wrong moment. And you're going home. And the US has cobbled it together. And I really do mean cobbled it, because it was not always smooth in Tokyo, but they've cobbled it together to win 4 straight golds. And so getting the 5th is going to be a definite challenge.
Yeah, that's why I appreciate the warm-up schedule of this US team, because they're going through high-level opponents, including high-level FIBA drilled opponents. I think that means something. I like FIBA refs. Maybe it's because I cover a lot of the NBL out here, and those refs aren't great. But FIBA refs, I like. They allow a certain amount of physicality, and
they're very experienced. That. They're all very experienced. The FIBA refs,
and
you make it to the
with the guys.
Yeah. You make it to the Olympics with the FIBA refs. You've gone through many layers of evaluation.
Yeah, there was so you can't call live ball timeouts, right? There was a situation here in the NBL where a team was down 2 points. One of the American players got a rebound. There was about 6 seconds left, so he should dribble the ball up and try to get a bucket to tie the game or get the lead. He's on the floor, got the loose ball, started calling a timeout. At that point, the game was over. And that's just, again, it's a small thing, but that cost that team a win, and that result can cost that team a spot in the playoffs and things like that. Again,
timeouts are live ball timeouts are so routine in the NBA.
Yep. And I think even the guys on other FIBA teams who play in the NBA, who are still well drilled enough in FIBA basketball. So I'm talking about your Schroeders and your Giddies and some of these guys. I think that even they might think, oh, I'm diving on a loose ball, I might call a timeout here. I can see them falling for that. as well drilled as they are in the FIBA game and as many FIBA games as they've played, I can see them going back to old habits,
I
those
agree.
NBA habits, and doing
Nature.
that. Yeah. It's that sort of issue. Again, I think it's maybe the only issue for Team USA, that they are not well drilled in playing FIBA basketball. I think that's something that Australia can largely avoid. A lot of these guys have either played for the national team a significant amount of time, or they have been in the NBL or played FIBA basketball, whether that's in Europe or Australia. I think that they're okay in those sorts of areas. I think the only real issue that Australia faced was a lot of dudes got traded during training camp. So Giddey got traded about a week before, had to go to Chicago for a medical.
You're so right. Yeah.
It's the only thing, right? Giddey got traded, so it was about a week before, had to go to Chicago for a few days for a medical. So he came into camp sort of a bit underdone. He was a bit jet lagged. He just did 2 long haul flights in a matter of 3 or 4 days. And then Dyson Daniels got traded. Thankfully, he didn't have to go for a medical. Josh Green got traded.
Yeah, I was out there. I was out there before the game, and I'm like, all you dudes just got traded.
And again, so everyone's on a different team, but when they came together, I think there was some trust that they were okay. What do you...
Did they make him go all the way to Chicago, or did they let him just come to LA?
Giddey went all the way to Chicago.
Oh my God. I didn't know that. Yeah. In the NBA, normally, they've trusted facilities that they'll go to.
Yeah.
I didn't know that they made him go. I mean, I guess it was a big trade. It's a player they're going to invest, probably 9 figures in. So I guess they wanted. I guess I get it, but that extra 3 hours each way, you don't get the nonstop. That's yeah.
No, 3 hours. That's 4 hours. That's an extra. And when you go from Australia, for those who don't know, you get on a flight at like 11 a.m. in the morning. You land in LA at 6 a.m., but that's after a 15-hour flight. And then you have to wait for your next flight to Chicago. And then you're all of a sudden in either Eastern or Central or whatever time it is. And you land, it's the evening, and it's just a lot of time in transit. It's not a nice thing to go through. Every time I go to America, I've got to go through that. You guys, again, thank your lucky stars that you don't have to do that.
Coming from
watch an NBA game.
Going from Australasia to North America, as somebody who's done it a handful of times, way worse than the other way around. The other way around is manageable. Australasia to North America is as brutal of a switch over in body clock as exists in the world.
Yeah, you have to accept that you're going to lose a day. That's what we go through. Before I let you go, what is the thing that Team USA? Where do you think their downfall could be now? Because the idea is they are, I think, probably the most stacked team since the Dream Team, and maybe even better than them, right? Just as far as the talent and how credentialed they are. But the Olympics can be a really tough beast where one game you don't shoot it well and the other team does shoot it well and they're able to stop you in a few areas. Again, from the quarterfinals onwards, that's a knockout tournament and one game can ruin you, right? Where do you think the USA could slip? Where's the chink in the armor there?
So one thing that I see is a strength that could possibly trip them up. Steve Kerr is committed to what we call hockey substitutions, which is where he replaces all 5 guys on the floor at once. And the reason that he wants to do that is the huge advantage that the U.S. has in depth. And what he basically wants is his players to go all out for 5 minutes and then replace them with 5 fresh bodies. Also, because of the lack of chemistry and the lack of time together, if you maximize these guys in these 5-man units, it's easier to kind of figure out, okay, this is my 5. I'm going to play with my 5, as opposed to a rotation where you now may be able to get used to playing with 4 to 7 different players. If you only have to get used to playing with those 4 players, it sort of compartmentalizes it. But when you play that way and they're committed to it, and this is the way that they've been playing, it kind of can trap you in a box a little bit. So this is sort of a funny example, but the other night when the U.S. was playing Serbia, Steph Curry is red hot. He's having one of these Steph Curry nights. The crowd in Abu Dhabi, who will probably never get to see Steph play again there, the record crowds, people are falling out of the rafters there, and they get to see Steph drilling these threes. We're midway through the second quarter. Steph has 18 points in 11 minutes. He's hit 4 3-pointers, and the buzzer sounds, and in comes his replacement. And Steve Kerr was joking after the game about how Warriors fans have hated him for years when he's taken Steph out of these games, when he's got 45 points through 3 quarters or something. Even Steph was like, what? I'm coming out. I might score 45 in this sucker. And being committed to that, and it causes you problems on both ends, right? Because even if you're in a game, you're like, you know what, actually, something's going really well. I'm not going to take this group out, or I'm going to replace with then you get in the situation, what are we going to do here? This player is carrying us. So I guess I'll leave him in, but what about now? He hasn't played with these other 4 guys. So I totally understand why they're doing this, and it's working. They look good. And I'm not saying going the other way is smart either, because going the other way, you have chemistry problems, but they are sort of hemming themselves in a little bit with the way they've elected to strategize for this. And he is moving, he's changing his starting lineup a little bit. But he's pretty much declared when Steph is on the floor, he'll be with LeBron. LeBron and Steph are going to be on the floor at the same time. That's what they're working on together. And, as a golf fan, it reminds me of 15 years ago when, Steph and LeBron have a rivalry. They're fine now, but, they had this rivalry. As a golf fan in the Ryder Cup, maybe this goes over 99% of your audience, but they decided to play Phil Mickelson and Tiger Woods together in the Ryder Cup. And these are the number 1 and number 2 players in the world, the two most dominant players of their generation. And they don't really like each other. And it went absolutely horribly. And one of the reasons why the Ryder Cup was lost, he's decided Steph and LeBron are fused together. So, what happens if you get in a situation where you may want LeBron and not Steph, or want Steph and not LeBron? Well, of course you can do it. They're basketball players, but you'll have spent this period of time saying you guys are just together. So again, I don't think it will cause a complete failure of a game or anything, but in this style of 40-minute basketball, and I'm very guilty of keep saying this because my audience almost all the time, 40-minute basketball is so foreign. It's everybody else is just the same. You have a bad 5 minutes, you lose. And they have a bad shift, or Steve Kerr has to leave his comfort zone a little bit because it's a close game, and he plays a group of guys together that doesn't have chemistry because they haven't honed it, and it turns into a bad 5 minutes. That's what. So I think they're a little. That's a little bit of a crack in the armor, is that the way that they are electing to go about this. And also Durant isn't playing. And when Durant gets healthy, you're going to throw him into the mix. So I've just seen it. I've covered USA basketball since 2006, and I have covered them in 3 major tournaments where they didn't win. And they won every major tournament from 2007 to 2019. So there hasn't been that many, but I have actually been at 3 major tournaments that they didn't win. And I saw how it happened. And it happened with stuff like this. It just happened to be in the World Cups, not in the Olympics. But I've covered 3 World Cups. The U.S. lost all 3. So they're not having me back to Qatar for sure. But I've seen teams that looked impenetrable that have been beaten for these types of reasons.
Before I actually let you go, do you have a question for me? I think I did this to you last time where...
What did I ask?
I covered what did you ask last time? I don't remember. But yeah, I covered the Australian team very closely, and it's sort of a year-round thing, and it's one team. What do you have for me?
You cover the NBL year-round. I mean, I was...
True, and I cover the NBA too. I cover everything, but there is a focus on the
national
team.
Who's coming out of Group A?
I think it will be Australia, and I believe it will be Canada. As good as I think Greece is, and it's Giannis as the guy who is the sort of that the ball is going to, and they have really good shooters. They get up 30 plus threes a game. It's surrounded by guys like Papa Nicolau and Larent Zarkis and Kalathis and good shooters. Thomas Walkup is their naturalized American guy. I I still think Australia has the talent, and I think from what I've seen so far, they have the connectivity to get over Greece, and I think Spain is in similar to Australia, but I think less so, in an awkward spot in their transition from old to new. That's what I feel. So if I think it's going to be two teams, if I had to bet on it, it would be Canada and Australia in some order. And I think the games can be close enough that there might be another team that goes through. And if there is another team, I think it's Greece.
I agree. Canada is as talented as some Team USAs have been. Maybe not in the Olympics, but certainly in the World Cup, for sure. So definitely. And, I got a good look at Greece last year because they were in USA's group in Manila. And so you see all the games, and they have some good players in that team. And Nick Kalathis is Dennis Schroeder light. But, and he has been around a long time. Like, I can still remember when, in 2006, when the Greeks upset the Americans in that World Championships. They had this old mid to late 30s savvy guard named Theodosis Papaloukas, who literally had gray hair out there. And he was much bigger. He was like 6'6", 6'7". He's bigger than Kalathis. But Kalathis has that same type of command on the court. He's been around a long time. He's an American of Greek descent. Has played in Greece he played in the NBA for a little while, but basically, played in Greece his whole pro career, and has great chemistry with these guys. And Giannis individually, Giannis can have a 40-point FIBA game, no doubt. It is a little easier to defend Giannis in FIBA than it is in the NBA. Because you can sit in the paint and just throw your body in front of him. In the 2019,
you can actually form a wall. You can actually stand Van Gundy and form a wall.
Yeah. In the 2019 World Cup, which is the last major international event Giannis played in, he was the reigning NBA MVP at the time, I think. And I think that's right. And maybe he wasn't yet, but anyway, he was one of the best players in the NBA already. And he fouled out of several games. And the last game that he played, which I believe was against Brazil, where they didn't qualify for the next round, he was called for some fouls that, if I were him, if he had declared he would never play again for his national team, I wouldn't have blamed him. Because the way they played him was so preposterous. And so there is some things that you can use against Giannis in the FIBA game that you can't use against him in the NBA game. So I do think that might be a factor.
Yeah, Giannis wasn't particularly effective in that World Cup, but
you're being kind.
As in, that was, I remember in Australia, everyone watched that and they thought, do we even need Ben Simmons on this Australian team? Because how would a non-shooting athletic sort of
it's not an unreasonable conversation.
Right. But he looked really good in the Olympic qualifying tournament over the past few weeks. So I don't know. There's maybe hope for the Greeks that he can do something. This is your last Olympics, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm giving up the national team after this. I've done my duty. I'm giving up the national team after this because it's this, it's in the summer. It's these giant month-long overseas trips. It's incredibly, it's an incredible experience to go to Abu. I spent the last week in Abu Dhabi, and I don't know what it's like in the middle of the outback in the summer, but I don't think it could be worse than Abu Dhabi in the summer because they have humidity in that desert. But the opportunity to be in Abu Dhabi several times is just it's amazing to be with the team, to to go to the Grand Mosque with the players and coaches. It's a great experience. And I've had the majority of my time with the national team has been in Asia. I've covered two big events in Japan, China, Manila. This is the first time I've ever covered an event in Europe. And so, here you have a week in London. To be able to spend a week in London in July, amazing. London's my favorite place on earth, pretty much. 3 weeks in France, it's going to be a lot of work, a lot of logistics and stuff. But it's one of the reasons why the U.S. has such a great team, that all these guys signed up, because they were like, I'm sure they're all going to stay in Europe after it's over to go on trips with their families. But and they've worked very hard to make sure the families are going to have a good experience. And so that's one of the reasons. I mean, you say, talk about Team USA's vacations a little bit more. Well, it's one of the reasons why they have all these dudes on this team, because, a bunch of these guys already have gold medals, and a bunch of these guys don't need to do anything and they can take their summer off. But the opportunity to do it in Paris is and the thing about it is that the last three major international events have been in Asia. The last two World Cups and the last Olympics were in Asia, and the last Olympics were half an Olympics because of the COVID rules. And so, and the Olympics before that were in Rio. There hasn't been an Olympics in Europe since 2012. And so it's a great opportunity, maybe even a once in a lifetime opportunity. So that has to do with this, and to be able to be alongside them for it is it's definitely a great experience. And covering the national team is so rewarding. When I go into these locker rooms, the Boston Celtics just won the title, and you go into the locker room and you're being around them and they're winning the NBA finals, and it's like, that you're with them for that whole run and everything. But my connection with Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown and Derek White and Marcus Smart goes back to spending 3 weeks in China with them in 2019. I will always have a connection with the players from the 2021 Olympic team, because we were essentially in a quasi bubble in Tokyo. It wasn't quite like the Orlando bubble. The vaccine was out and everything, but the Japanese didn't know the vaccine was out, and they treated it like we were still full COVID. They also believed every American was radiating COVID. That was just a Japanese mantra at the time. And we went through all that. If you were in that situation together, where basically Tokyo only existed outside your window, that was a thing. So these experiences are tremendous career experiences. And so this will be, to me, this is all going to be about the basketball. The last Olympics was about COVID. This is all going to be about the basketball and the setting. So it should be great.
Well, thank you for your service. Who takes over from you? Is that Bontemps? Is he going to take that?
He wants to. We'll see if our bosses agree. But no, I think it will be him. And I had sort of the grunt work before I took over the national team of having to go to the training camp in Las Vegas, which is a very hard, long week. And I had to go do that. And then the man who covered the team before me would then go off to preseason events in Spain and on various islands and stuff. And I was back at home, but now that's me in that seat where I get to go to Abu Dhabi and London, and I made Bontemps go to Las Vegas in 115 degrees. Although I got my desert time this summer.
Cool. Well, you're in London. Please enjoy that. USA, what is it? South Sudan, Germany. The Boomers are in Orleans. They got Puerto Rico. I'm ready for a 2:30 a.m. wake up for that game.
Brutal.
And then they have France.
Yeah, you better get to bed. Later. You better get to bed.
I've got to sleep soon. Safe travels to Paris, and then travels up to Lille as well. And then, I hope you enjoy the tournament. Thanks for
I think the Aussie fans are in for a very exciting couple of weeks here. I don't know how it's going to go, but it's going to be exciting. I know that.
For their sake, I hope so. And for this podcast's sake, I hope so too. It'd be good to do more of these. But thank you for joining me.
All right.
I always appreciate your time.
Take care.